Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood. I'm your host for this regular monthly series of discussions focused on an article or book review published in the American Scientific Affiliation journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. This month, we're discussing the book Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. It was reviewed in the March issue of Perspectives by Sarah Tolzman. So today, we're going to welcome Jim Costa to Diving Deeper Discussion. Jim, it's good to have you with us.
Hey, wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah. Jim is an evolutionary biologist and an entomologist, and we've just run into each other through this book review, so that's a happy circumstance. And he's a Darwin and Wallace scholar who's been at Western Carolina University and an administrator at Highlands Biological Station. Jim teaches courses in biogeography, where I'm sure he features the Wallace line at some point. A course on Darwin's The Origin of Species, and I'm guessing his students would be reading his 2009 book, The Annotated Origin, as their text, because they give a careful reading. He also teaches courses in comparative and temperate tropical ecology, and just this week, he will be leading a group getting ready to go down to the Galapagos and do some Darwin tracing in the Galapagos. I don't think Wallace ever made it to the Galapagos, did he?
No,
He did. Yeah.
no, sadly, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in addition to Radical by Nature, Jim has published a facsimile of Wallace's species notebook. He's done that annotation of the first edition of The Origin of Species by Darwin, as they said. He's also done a comparison of Darwin and Wallace's work, developing their theories of evolution by natural selection, a kind of side-by-side comparison. And next to, my favorite, which I just was introduced to, the Radical here, my other favorite is a book called The Other Insect Societies on the so-called minor social insects. And Jim, I actually remember ordering that for our libraries when it came out. So
hey, great.
Thank you very much for putting that in the collection. I think I pointed a few of my non-major students to that in talking about social insects.
That's great. Gotta love those underappreciated insects.
Exactly. Oh, well, Jim, it's so good to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time to do so. And we want to get right into this conversation, and we will have some questions to the audience, but I wanted to do a little bit of background work because we don't really, know. Tell us how you came to be an entomologist, and we'll start with that, and then we'll move to Darwin and Wallace. How's that?
Sure. Wow. Well, an entomologist, well, I think unlike many entomologists, I was not into insects as a kid, but I was I guess, a sort of kid naturalist. I was really into nature, and especially astronomy and birds, wildflowers. And so I already had kind of an interest in the natural world. And actually, I was introduced to insects as an undergraduate. I went to SUNY Cortland College in upstate New York. And there was as it happened, just fortuitously, as I was looking for research experience opportunities, there was a faculty member, Terence Fitzgerald, a very fine entomologist. Little did I know how, just what an excellent entomologist and evolutionary biologist he was, and behaviorist. And so it was just fortuitous. I started working as a research assistant in behavioral ecology with Professor Fitzgerald, and became really, this was to open my eyes to a whole other facet of the natural world. I hadn't really known much or appreciated insects before then. And I think that, so in a nutshell, that really launched me then. I continued on in graduate school studying insect ecology and then population genetics and behavior.
Right. And insect ecology, where did you study that and with whom?
My graduate work was at the University of Georgia in
Okay.
Athens, and I worked with Kenneth Ross, Ken Ross, who's a fire ant population geneticist, really just an also an outstanding entomologist and geneticist. He had a sort of a dual appointment there in entomology and genetics. So I felt like my program really had the best of two fascinating worlds. I was
Right.
taking the full range of entomological courses as a major there, and then as well, the various genetics courses and kind of putting these together.
Oh,
So that
great.
was once again I counted myself just lucky. It was fortuitous that I met in a class, actually a seminar course, the Ken Ross, who was to become then my eventual major professor for my PhD. I
Right.
worked with another professor, Dak Crosley, who is an ecologist for my master's work, and he introduced me to the broader world of insect ecosystem ecology and community ecology.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You've come from great soil, great academic soil, and we could spend just this whole time talking about entomologists and ecologists that we know, but we
Mm.
won't. We'll we'll move back in. So tell me how Darwin and Wallace entered your life in this, and I'm going to move to the coda in your book. It's
Mm.
just really fascinating here in those last few pages, and you're talking
Mm.
about discovering you're being on a bus on the way to
Yeah.
the Linnean Society in London. But that sounded the end of the story. So could you tell us from the beginning of the story? How does that come into your experience?
That was quite a coincidence, that discovery with the Linnean Society, and I guess it seemed like an unlikely path. I mean, I mentioned I was sort of a kid naturalist, but and also had an interest in history of science even as a teenager. At that
Mm,
time, really, my passion was mainly astronomy, and a lot of it was history of astronomy and um, but along the way, history of evolution caught my attention, and that really stayed with me. So I think it's fair to say that all the while I was studying and sort of training in a sense as a biologist, I always I sort of nurtured that interest in understanding where the ideas came from, and when I became an educator, a faculty member myself, and even before as a postdoc, I was at the MCZ at Harvard and was given opportunities to teach. And
mhm,
so those interests were there in helping students better understand the development of ideas. And so this is what launched me on delving more deeply into understanding the development of Darwin's thinking.
mhm,
And so that kind of, in a way, brings me to the curious bus ride that to the Linnaean. I had come out, you mentioned, John, in 2009 with an annotated edition of On the Origin of Species. And that grew out of years of teaching the book and accumulating notes and observations, building on questions that students would have. And for the longest time, I would have them, well, they would have the book itself, which would typically be the facsimile from 1964 that Harvard published with a
mhm,
nice introduction by Ernst Mayr. And
mhm,
then, so they would buy that, but then they would also have a stack of, my notes. And at some point, I thought it just made sense to try to put them together. And
mhm,
so, after working on the other insect societies and having such a wonderful experience with my editors and others at Harvard University Press, sort of pitched this idea. And fortuitously, the Darwin bicentennial was coming up, and so
right.
they were very, very keen. So this is a long way to say that one thing leads to another, because that
Mhm,
led to an invitation to teach in Harvard's Darwin program, which for many years was based at the University of Oxford in the UK. And this was about a month plus long program,
mhm,
broken into two very intensive, in-depth courses. One of them was history of evolution, and the other was modern evolution. So basically, antiquity to the so-called modern synthesis and modern
mhm.
synthesis to the present. And
Okay.
And it was in the context of that course and my contributions to those courses that I had known, of course, about Wallace, and I knew much more about Darwin.
Hmm.
But I was reading a paper in the bus as we were taking the students for a visit to the Linnean Society. We had an appointment, and the Linnean is this fabulous, not only the library but the Linnean collection, the
Hmm.
crown jewels of biology, and so it's always one of the highlights of the course experience. And I happened to be reading a paper about Wallace, and and really remarkable extended quotes were given that were just so overtly evolutionary in there. And I just thought, I have never heard of anything
Yeah.
like this
Right.
from Wallace. What in the world? And I was struggling to figure out where this material that's quoted, where is it? Like, where is this material? I need to get hold of this. And finally, in a footnote, I discovered that it was a manuscript that was in the collection at the Linnean Society.
Mm.
So it was really just remarkable. And my co-instructor Andrew Berry, and really the person who put together this whole program, the Harvard Darwin program, sitting near me, I think I must have sort of elbowed him, saying, Andrew, you look at this, can he was also unfamiliar with these fascinating evolutionary sounding speculations that were being quoted. And he agreed once we got to the Linnean, as soon as I got there, I asked the librarian, where is this manuscript? And we had to wait till we were finished working with the
Right.
students. And then I had an opportunity. They were very gracious to pull it off the shelf. And there it was. While it was
Yeah.
Wallace's Species Notebook,
Right.
one of his field notebooks from Southeast Asia, and just sort of perusing this remarkable document, and I was just astounded. And I thought, no, clearly I was not the first, to read this. I was reading a paper that was quoting
Yep.
from it,
Yep.
so it was known by a very small number, I think, of
Yep.
historians. And I was just determined to bring this to a much wider audience
Right.
of
Right.
biologists and historians and philosophers of science.
Jim, thanks for that summary because that is so many different touch points with what we do in the ASA. We have individuals who are keenly interested in the history of science in different fields, of course, in different areas. And of course, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about museums and libraries at these
Mm,
major institutions, these holdings of these documents. I know when I was at Berkeley, I needed history on a
mm,
egg mass of an insect that I'd found that was kind of interesting. All of a sudden, I'm back picking up documents from
mm.
1840 and
Wow.
reading a description in Europe of a similar kind of thing and going, whoa. And I never expected that to happen. And yet, that's the kind of trajectory of an academic career. So thanks for sketching that out for
The
us.
benefits of a great library. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are great institutions and so valuable. And as you
Mm,
said, known to a handful of scholars, a few individuals, and a few wonderful librarians who know these things. But yeah, you've brought this now in multiple forms to a much wider audience.
mm,
So I want to just turn to Wallace a bit more. Um, this thing about Wallace and Darwin.
mm.
Um, well, maybe we'll get at this from the questions rather than me jumping in. Let's get to the audience questions first, and then
Sure.
if it slows down, I have many.
Okay.
So, as I said to Jim folks, my introduction to Wallace was in probably 1967 in a course on titled Phylogenetic Theory, because I was at a Christian college, North Park College in Chicago, and you didn't want to be taking an evolution course, but you could take a phylogenetic theory course, and that just worked in the catalog that parents would see. And it also worked for me because I had no idea what phylogenetic theory was. It sounded really interesting. but I was introduced to Wallace, but just briefly as
Mm,
this guy contemporaneous with Darwin who was somehow interested in spiritual matters. And
mm,
then conflated with that was that he had different ideas about the evolution of humans. But
mhm,
the spiritualism and that you've parsed out so carefully, Jim, with from his thinking about human evolution in the mind, those in my head at least got conflated. And so
mm,
thanks for, I mean, I'm so thankful for this because it opens up Wallace in ways that I think is going to be very helpful.
mm.
As we're going to do by opening up the mics now, and our control host, Janelle, will,
Yeah, so you
okay.
people can unmute themselves now if they're going to speak.
So you'll see on the reactions down on the bottom, somewhere on the bottom of your screen, likely you'll have a reaction. Go ahead and if you would put up your hand on that and do the raised hand function, and I can recognize you.
We have Joseph has his hand up.
Oh, there I see it.
Oh
Joseph, go
yeah.
ahead and unmute and ask your question, please.
Thank you, John. Just a comment. It's interesting that we're talking about Darwin on the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial.
Mm,
Yeah.
It began in Dayton, Tennessee
mhm.
on July the 10th and went on for about a week. If you can enable the sharing, I have a few historic photos of that event. It'll only take a minute.
John, do you want to do that, or shall we wait until the end to do that?
Maybe we should, yeah, Joseph, could we should do that at the end so we could keep the flow going?
Up to you.
Would that be all right?
Up to you, John.
Okay. Thanks for that reminder. Yeah, history escapes us unless we get reminded. Del Kuhn has raised his hand. Del?
Yeah, thanks, John and Jim. Thanks for a book that's a page turner. I really enjoyed reading it. And I
Oh,
guess my
thanks.
question is, Darwin and Wallace, and I know from one of the footnotes you've done a full-length book on them, which our library system does not have. So I'm
Mm.
kind of hoping for a 25 word or less, or however long you want to take before John comes back to ask you. How did each, how did each of the two of them differ or were similar into how they came to the conclusion of natural selection? And I'm kind
Mm,
of backing into that from Wallace's comment that the reason he and Darwin and no one else were
mm.
because they were both beetle enthusiasts.
Right.
My impression of Wallace from your book is that it is not a flippant answer. It might be
Mm.
an intriguing way into it, but I do not think he was being flippant. So should there,
Yeah.
if there were more beetles, would there more beetle enthusiasts, would there have been more discoveries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It is interesting. I mean, that was such a surprising comment from Wallace. That was given in 1909 because the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. I think his audience must have been surprised too when he said that he'd sort of declared, you know, the single most important thing that led Darwin and myself to our, you know, discoveries was that we both had in our youth, you know, this passion for beetle collecting. And I think you're right. He wasn't being flippant in that beetle. I think he appreciated, as Darwin did, beetles, you know, in their almost infinite variety. I mean, it's a massive group of insects, incredibly diverse species. So I think that someone interested in the nature of species and varieties would really just revel in beetles, as Darwin did, as Wallace did. Um, he, you know, I think, of course, there's more to it than simply that. That may have set them on a sort of trajectory, let's say. But you know, as far as their own pathways to natural selection and such, that was that was interesting. I trace in that book that you mentioned some interesting parallels, like readings, you know, authors that that they both devoured in their youth, like Humboldt, for example. Pardon me. But actually coming to the idea of evolution or transmutation, as they called it, um, they actually there were some fundamental differences too. Darwin, I kind of refer to Darwin sometimes as the reluctant evolutionist. You know, he sort of, against his own expectations, came around to accepting this idea. And Wallace, it's very much in keeping with Wallace the Contrarian. You know, I could have easily entitled this book Contrarian. You know, I mean that's what Wallace and the idea of transmutation as a rather, you know, I don't know if heretical is too strong a word, but definitely not respectable, you know, idea that when he in reading these ideas from Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, just immediately embraced it. That's Wallace the Contrarian, precisely, I think, because it was, you know, such a fringe, radical notion that he was, you know, ready, willing, and able to give it an airing. Darwin had to come, you know, very, very slowly to accept the idea. So their pathways were very similar in some ways, and when you drill down a little bit, there were some fundamental differences in the dynamic that led them to their discoveries.
That's really helpful, Jim. The youthful passion for beetles, that discovery, and I'm thinking now also of their experience in the tropics. They go from the British Isles, they both get on a ship, and you're slowly introduced as you stop, the Canary Islands or wherever you stop along the way, and as you're moving tropically and things are changing. But I was reminded as you guys were talking about, well, insects for one, but I was in the North Temperate, not the greatest diversity. But I remember being in Chicago for the down at the tip of Lake Michigan for the spring migration of warblers.
Yeah.
And my wife and I went out with binoculars and a bird book, not knowing anything but robins, crows, and magpie. But wave after wave of warblers would come into these trees. They would fly in and they'd be bouncing around the tree, and then whoosh, out a flight would go and another flight would come in. 8, 9, 10, 15 new species in an hour. And I was almost passing out, with what was happening. And your descriptions of Wallace going up the river, and it's that butterfly and that butterfly. And if you've never collected, it just takes you over. I feel like you go from your left brain rational to your right brain. You're just putting things together in a way that. So I guess I would say that psychokinetic, that tactile experience, that emotional experience of being first person with the newness and the overwhelming abundance of that thing, it just changes your mind. You just can't look at the world the same way. So that experience, but the other one you didn't mention was they both were rock hounds. They both paid attention to the earth, to geology, and fossils. And that's the other thing, that notion of deep time. It is the 1820s when dinosauria, right, are being, uncovered.
You
have all this stuff coming at you. Go ahead.
Being that was a very exciting period from about the turn of the century, but through the 1850s even. I think the term was maybe coined in the 1840s by Owen, the term dinosaur, and its recognition of this now extinct whole fauna that must have existed. And true, and I think it's fair to say that Darwin maybe had a bit more of the formal education and interest in geology. Having learned from some of his professors at Cambridge. Right. And this, but you're absolutely right. This is one of the commonalities in there. Wallace is largely self-educated. Darwin is formally educated, right? First in Edinburgh, then at the University of Cambridge, Christ College. And but what they're reading, what they're learning about, Wallace on his own, Darwin with his professors, very much in parallel. Humboldt, Charles Lyell's exciting works, that start to come out 1830, 32, 33. Humboldt and Lyell are tremendous, and it's fair to say that maybe those two work. So geological and then Humboldtian big picture, maybe those were the two most formative experiences in terms of education for Darwin and Wallace.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Brian, you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, when you think of natural selection, Darwin's name immediately comes to mind. Yet Wallace also had similar thoughts. Do you think Wallace is getting the credit he deserves?
Well, no. I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book. I find both of them, endlessly interesting. But Wallace, I realized even as a biologist myself, I knew so little about his life and thought. And if that was true of biologists, then outside of the field, I mean, he's virtually unknown, and so I think, you know, is he underappreciated? Absolutely. And there's probably some complex reasons for that. Some of that is Wallace's own doing, in interesting ways. And some of it is sort of just circumstances of the way we do tend to remember historical figures. And it is kind of interesting to reflect on that dynamic, how many figures of the past that of those who lived and made fundamental contributions, how many of those get remembered is a small fraction. So I did want to do what I could to help my students, fellow biologists, but then ultimately with this book, a wider audience, help them better understand, the life and thinking of this interesting person. And so, I don't know that he will never become a sort of, icon, of course, the way Darwin is. But I think we can do better in sort of acknowledging the joint credit that he should get for the discovery of natural selection and some of his other discoveries as well.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Sure,
Good.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Terry Defoe.
Yes, Jim, I'm just wondering if you are familiar with this book by Peter Raby on
Yeah, Peter
Wallace.
Raby's book. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I had that sitting on my shelf for a long time before I read it and realized that,
That's nicely done. Yeah.
yes. I'm just wanted to ask about Wallace near the end of his life where he was involved in seances and so on. It almost seemed to me he went off the deep end with that. And I have a question in my mind about how a scientist like himself how he was able to balance those two aspects of his life, which seems so very different.
Yeah. That it's a very good question. I mean, I've thought long and hard. I've tried to understand myself um, and read Wallace pretty closely, trying to understand. Certainly his contemporaries, his friends in the scientific community did not understand. But I came to see that, and this is maybe just, Wallace is sort of a singular personality, an interesting thinker, and there is a rationality to it. He makes an argument, and it's not an unreasonable argument that could there not be, if we treat this what he called the kind of spirit realm as just another branch of natural history, could there not be such a realm that we simply don't yet have the ability, the technology, or whatever it may take to successfully understand it, to penetrate it, to study it, and he drew an analogy, and I think I I maybe quote from him, or I discussed this in the book, but his analogy was with the early discovery of microorganisms, but especially protists and such. And he sort of points out that, there was a time when, if one could claim that very small animalcules were swimming around in the water, in ponds and things, but you just couldn't see them with the naked eye. That individual would be, to sort of dismissed as nuts, delusional. But with the right technology, even an elementary microscope, you're able to actually see, little paramecia and volvox and these other microorganisms. And indeed, there's a whole world, right, of small protists swimming around in droplets of water, right, taken from. And so that was a powerful analogy for Wallace, that if you just have the right technology, this can open your eyes to a whole new facet of the world. And indeed, those people that may have claimed to see microorganisms in water were not crazy, right? And so similarly, he thought maybe we just lack the proper technology. We don't know how to penetrate or communicate with this other realm. And I think his disappointment in his early years after he went public with his commitment to spiritualism, the spiritualist movement at the time, was that his fellow scientists would not accept that argument. They would not take it seriously. And he felt that they were too quick to dismiss and denounce it as nonsense, pseudoscience, So that was a great source of disappointment. And it's very much Wallace's personality that I think that he's not put off by that. In fact, he will dig his heels in even deeper, and he's determined then to really pursue this, and I imagine in hopes of eventually convincing others, which in this case he may have had some success, but not certainly with many of the mainstream naturalists of his time.
Yes, I think each one of us in the ASA has had to negotiate that balance between the spiritual and the material world, even in balancing our faith with our science.
Yeah, yeah.
And as a pastor, that's an interesting topic to me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go
It's
ahead, Jim.
fascinating to consider that Wallace, sometimes his commitment to spiritualism is presented as a conversion. Like suddenly he, went from a rather doctrinaire, kind of scientific naturalistic thinker to a spiritualist. But I'll just mention briefly, and maybe this will come up again in questions, but you can really see elements of in earlier writings by Wallace interested in the nature of mind, which is very difficult even today to truly understand, right? But hypnotism, mesmerism, and also a kind of idealistic streak that's very apparent in his youth, in his 20s, in his teens. Kind of an idealist. I call him in some of my writing a sort of a utopian, one who is yearning for a utopia. And I see that as part and parcel, that his commitment to spiritualism was not some sudden about face, but a natural extension of very long-held kind of ideas about the nature of the world that he was committed to.
Yes.
Thank you, Jim, for that follow-up. It reminds me, throughout your book, you do a kind of what I think of a nuanced understanding of this side of Wallace and others. And mesmerism and then spiritism is alive in that culture, and live questions, just as you're pointing out, questions of mind today, mind-body problems. We don't have answers to these things. But interestingly, I think at one point I remember you talking about textbook descriptions, and we just go to history, Galileo. I think for me, first year teaching undergraduates, and I pick up the biology book, and here is the head of the section is a story of Galileo, complete with a piece of artwork. And it wasn't even good fiction that they were writing. It was just terrible.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of holding my head and I think, do I dare put this textbook in front of my students? The rest of the biology seems like it's okay as far as I know, but this piece, it's just a caricature
Sort of a
of,
caricature. Yeah, yeah,
yes, of the
absolutely.
history of science and what people are actually doing. And that's
That's
in that
the
sense, your book is a vital contribution to what can happen in these large courses. You got a lot of material to get through.
mm,
That history stuff, we don't have time for that. Let's keep moving here. And so you end up with a population that can be really subject to being told just so stories, where the real
yeah.
story is much richer. So,
It's too easy to oversimplify, and it's just not unusual in our
no,
culture, sadly. And these things get distilled down to, you know, um, battles between, titanic forces, and um, the Scopes trial was mentioned a bit earlier, and
yes.
the popular conception of that trial comes through Hollywood, comes through
Mhm,
Inherit the Wind,
mhm,
and it's
mhm.
it's a largely, all I won't say completely inaccurate, but I would say almost completely
Yeah.
inaccurate account of the events, in the trial, and yet now that is what's going to stick with people. So yeah, I think the same is true in this case, a kind of
Yeah.
caricature.
I'm watching World War II documentaries, and I remember my dad watching Walter Cronkite in the 50s when we got a TV.
Mm.
And he said he was watching Walter Cronkite's little half-hour series on the World War II, and he says, I was there, and I don't remember it that way.
Hmm. Huh.
And it's just so there we are. Well, thank you for that. Steve, you've been waiting patiently with your hand raised. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for your collective memories as we share here. They're all so valuable. Um, just a comment before my question. I find it interesting that as we think about mind body, as it has been popularly put, that those who believe that the mind is incorporeal and continues on afterward or a part of it, uh, sometimes take a second step and say, well, then we can communicate with that existing mind and have seances. And that was in the 1800s, a very popular spiritualism type
Mm.
situation of taking that second step on that. My question has to do with uh, history knocking on our door again.
Mm.
In encountering extended evolutionary synthesis through James Shapiro's book, Evolution of You from the 21st Century and
Mm.
Epigenetics and so forth,
Mm.
it took me back, and maybe many of you, to almost a Lamarckian transmutation type situation again. And the question comes, uh, how much do we know about the environment changing gametes, both paternal and maternal, and continuing on to future generations, whether it be methylization or other things. Any thoughts about and how is Lamarckianism and epigenetics similar or different?
Mm. Yeah, those are good questions, and fascinating sort of subdisciplines now. Epigenetics. There is kind of there is almost a sort of Lamarckian-esque, there's a neo-Lamarckian kind of aspect to that, in a very, and I say neo-Lamarckian because Lamarck's ideas in terms of the way organisms respond to environment had a kind of, there was a little bit of arm waving in there, in that he had a kind of vitalistic element, organisms yearning or striving in one direction, or to do something, affecting maybe how vital fluids or whatever it might be are being directed into those organs, and then this being passed on, and in that way incrementally, very, very slowly modifying organs and such over time. But the more general idea of environment, um, directly influencing and having an effect on organisms that are heritable. Um, it was thought that once the germplasm, soma distinction was described by Weissman and others, that it was very clear that the very few cells are generative cells, and so environmental effects on most of the soma would not be relevant. And now I think there's a richer understanding now of how, in some ways, for example, through epigenetics, that experiences of the organism in their environment, environmental stresses perhaps, and other factors could have a lasting, sort of leave a lasting imprint in the form of regulatory elements, possibly methylation, but other means perhaps that will help influence gene expression in the next generation in development. There's also maybe more of an appreciation that the old germplasm soma distinction, it's a bit zoocentric, it's a bit animal centric, in that other organisms, like, well, plants, like many vascular plants, almost any so-called somatic cell can become a reproductive tissue, which is interesting, which means that unlike we mammals, we animals, in a sense, that environmental impacts that might affect the genetics of any of our somatic cells, for us, they may not get passed on, but for a plant, there's a much wider field for interaction and modification that tissue can develop into a meristem that becomes a flower, produce pollen or eggs, and in that way, it's interesting to think of that in a Lamarckian kind of sense. You can modify, a mutagen can modify the soma, so to speak, of a plant, and it can affect the next generation. I do think that it's a much richer understanding now, but much is still to be learned of the nature of inheritance. That the simplistic model that we all learn, our basic Mendelian genetics, turns out to be a rather small sort of component of a much wider, richer field of inheritance, of gene expression and regulation and those sorts of things.
And just generally, I'm not in the market in this normally, but how is extended evolutionary synthesis doing in the big world?
I would say, well, epigenetics, I mean, an exciting area, I think to sort of look at the extended synthesis in that way, it's doing very well, that we're sort of better and better understanding, the genomics era has opened the door to understanding at a much finer scale the structure of the genome, which is just pretty astoundingly complex. And the what you sort of realize with the technology, this perhaps always happens with new technologies. You begin to recognize how much you had simply assumed and how simplistic your models were. And so I'm no expert on epigenetics, but it's my sense that it's kind of this brave new world of understanding the nature of inheritance. So I think that field continues to advance, and genomics is certainly helping accelerate that because of the ability to understand at a more sort of a global scale genomically the structure, the expression. Within the genome, and the architecture that helps better understand the history, the bizarre and the wild architecture of genomes and how they are sort of almost jury-rigged and kind of accumulate in fascinating ways can only truly be understood now with this kind of a technology in the age of genomics.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Steve. My goodness, you just took me down a whole pathway that I wasn't thinking about. And that's the good thing about your book, Jim, that it opens up these questions. And the questions that Darwin and Wallace were struggling with, we're still struggling with today. And people were struggling with it, as you point out, in the century before them. And as you guys were talking, I'm sitting here thinking, how much they were able to infer with how little they knew. They just saw this much. and look at what they could infer. And now we have these genetic tools, and we've got the whole picture now. And no, we don't. But we've got a much better picture than we ever had before. And oh my, to be 20 again. This would be exciting to get started. Brian, you've raised your.
Oh, sorry.
Brian's raised.
I'm wondering if you have any opinions on this so-called third way of evolution that's starting to make inroads, it seems.
So I'm not familiar with that. What is the thinking there? What is the third way?
I'm not. It's sort of a challenge to neo-Darwinism. I know that, and I think that they're trying to make the case that there are other, as yet undiscovered mechanisms, and I think even that teleology has a place in the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term or the idea that neo-Darwinism, I do think that in light of for example the previous question, I've suggested that we should be thinking in terms of the kind of neo-Darwinism, that the science continues to change, so that kind of post so-called synthesis view of neo-Darwinism is itself being modified. Will there be as yet undiscovered aspects to the evolutionary process? I would say so. Absolutely. But I can't speak to of course, what might that be, or how will that be manifested? Teleology is an idea, a sort of way of thinking about things that has been with us for, since antiquity, really, for thousands and thousands of years. And I think there's a fundamental sort of difference in trying to understand the the evolutionary process in neo-Darwinism as a kind of undirected, kind of directed only by immediate environmental context. And so in the broader picture, rather undirected, versus a more, teleological idea that there may be an inborn or built-in tendency to change in certain directions and not others, or certain ways and not others. That idea can be even in an even bigger context, in a more theological context. It is where theistic evolution might come in, that it's a directed process. And so I don't know. Teleology is a very tough one, even in the neo Darwinism kind of view of things. And at the same time, there's no question that certain constraints, physics and chemistry, and there's only so many permutations of environmental context and the biotic and abiotic environment, that you can say, well, change can't be simply in any direction. You're building on what you have, your existing genetic architecture, and then responding to the demands of environment, whatever that might be. And that those responses, the range is not infinite, So yeah, it's a fascinating subject, but a difficult one,
It is, and Jim, it's a keen one for several of our members are interested and have been talking about, and we have two hands raised. I don't know if Steve, is this a follow-up into this same question? Or a different?
It is, or feel
Okay,
free.
go ahead then, please.
If I understand the third way, it's sort of an umbrella term for not only extended evolutionary synthesis, which includes saltation, quick acting jumps.
Okay.
And so it's saying there's a big change coming in several different ways, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah.
And on that, I find it another history knocking on our door here. Interesting. I don't know if you have any views on this or not, but uniformitarianism was a big discovery in the 1800s, that things in geology and others happen gradually. And that was the idea, gradualism. Yet, as we go along, we begin to understand that catastrophes really change things big time. And extended evolutionary synthesis makes a big point that catastrophes in our history was a time when the genetics really changed big time. And just because of the way we're put together, the genome will fight for survival, and it will change based upon its exterior environment to survive. And so it's a read-write situation on the computer, and it's written to big time in times of catastrophes. So I see an interesting combination of gradualism and catastrophes coming together. I don't know if you bumped into that or have any comments.
Yeah, I mean, I have read, in the context of the history of geology, it's interesting how some of these debates of old, they end up getting resolved in the middle somewhere, and it reminds me of, and this is a bit of a caricature itself, but the early history, the way that Lyell and others portrayed non-uniformitarians, and they sort of painted them with this broad brush as catastrophists, and as if they were arguing, all of the history of the world is punctuated by like one major catastrophe after another, and I think that was a device, a rhetorical device used by Lyell and others to set up a dichotomy and then argue for gradualism and uniformitarianism. And for a time in the 19th century, I mean, this was the revolutionary new way to understand, the nature of the world that mapped onto the nature of the history of life pretty nicely. But, in the 20th century, I mean, these ideas of catastrophic events, clearly they can occur, right? They do occur, asteroid impacts, occur, rarely, but when they do, they have, truly global, consequences, and to what extent those kind of reset, by paring the tree of life way back, pruning it way back, you're left with fewer lineages. Those that are left, I think you aptly mention how the genome will survive, will find ways to adapt, and this is what occurs, and so it's not a coincidence that the geological periods were recognized on the basis of faunal, pretty major faunal shifts, and then later an understanding of what might have precipitated those shifts, came into understanding, Permian extinction, the end Cretaceous event, those sorts of things. I think now geologists, it must be, it's fair to say, if you read historians like Martin Rudwick's great work, an understanding that both of these are true. Gradualism, uniformity, but also at a higher scale, you could say, and this is kind of not just the sort of rhetorical sleight of hand, but you could sort of say that catastrophic events are part of uniformity, we could probably say with confidence they will occur with some frequency, not predictable perhaps, but they will occur. And so in the history of the planet, perturbations minute and truly, cataclysmic, global, will occur. And those forces that are constantly acting will shape the history of the planet and life upon it. So I think we've kind of met in the middle now. We've recognized that Lyell was maybe being got carried away with the way he liked to portray catastrophists, and that in fact we could say, and purposely, right, that modern geology is perfectly comfortable with accepting catastrophic events in the history of geology and the history of the planet.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Carlos, you've had your hand up.
Sure. Thank you, John. Brian, thank you especially, and I know probably the reason behind your question. Uh, Brian is the president of Affiliation of Christian Biologists, as you probably all know. And we have a special interest group in there called Teleology and Biological Evolution. And in the process of that group, and I don't see any of our other members here, we've been looking at the topic that both Jim and Steve have been talking about here recently. And one of the things that we've discovered is that a better word, or a word that really fits what we're trying to discuss, is teleonomy. It's been it's a word that was came up by Ernst Mayr and his colleagues a long time ago. And at the same time, we are interested in the ideas of teleology, and can we identify any particular patterns or modes that might suggest that there's a creator behind the process. So I think that the topics that you're getting into are very interesting. Yep. And relevant, and let's keep going in that direction.
Yeah. Thanks for that. You know, it's fascinating to think about how, I mean, these are questions that folks have been wrangling with for quite a long time, and Darwin as well, and Wallace as well. I was recently had occasion to give a talk connected with the centennial of the Scopes trial, and I was I was discussing Darwin's discussions with Asa Gray, you know, his friend and greatest supporter here in the U.S., the botanist at Harvard, who is also a deeply devout, you know, individual, and their extended correspondence over the nature of design. And I pointed out to my audience that, you know, it's interesting to consider Darwin's the epigraphs that he selected for On the Origin of Species. You know, he's quoting William Whewell, he's quoting Bacon, he's quoting Bishop Butler, and a lot of it turns on this question of design versus the creator working through natural law. So the older school idea of divine guidance of everything, or you know, the sort of everything being orchestrated everywhere at all times, directly in a very personal and interactive way by a creator, versus the creator of the clockwork universe that creates natural laws, and sort of having created those laws, like, you know, the classic example in Darwin's day would have been gravitation, right? Newtonian gravitation at the time. Sort of, you know, setting up the universe with these laws, and then allowing, you know, things to just sort of to play out, you know, according to those laws. And an overarching argument Darwin makes in The Origin is he wants to convince his readers that he sees natural selection as one of those natural laws, and that designedness, Darwin, I know that you all are, you know, you're very aware, as Darwin was, in the, you know, some of the big kind of theological difficulties, you know, understanding a plan, if there's a plan, and understanding pain and suffering, for example, and misery, and those were sort of particular areas for Darwin that he struggled with, and he preferred, he said, to feel like there was this is a world of natural laws, not that designedly there would be this pain and suffering, you know, in a very specific, you know, personally directed kind of way that wasn't a conception of a deity that he was at all comfortable with. So it's interesting, you know, your comment kind of makes me kind of think back to how Darwin and Wallace too kind of grappled with some of these questions about teleology, design, you know, the role of natural law, those sorts of things.
Thanks, Jim. You've just touched on a key theological debate that was going on in the 19th century and the 20th. And guess what? We are We are fresh into it in the 21st century. Pain, suffering, and other things. I'm
Yeah.
going to turn Bob and ask you to unmute, and we'll take your question.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, Jim. Very much appreciated. I was struck by your lecture at the Harvard alumni, where you focused on how much Darwin focused on himself, quoted 58 times my theory as compared to the collaborative work.
And the origin, yes.
I just put that into context here. Eric Klein teaches in the DC area, University of Maryland, American University, has written 1177 BC. And he talks about this cataclysmic time known as the Greek Dark Ages. And a conclusion he provides is that the only ones who survive that are the ones who work together. And I really see in the work of Wallace this harmony, the collaboration coming. I was meeting with Dan Siegel, neurologist of UCLA, last Thursday for dinner, and we were talking about interconnected and his most recent book on therapy through trauma. And how it too has the theme, how it's when we work together that we are able to survive, to evolve as an individual and a species. And I guess that's part of what I feel you're bringing up that is lost with, appreciating Wallace, is this more holistic. I mean, as a theologian, I do not see God as a separate entity out there on some mountaintop, but I find God in the presence of people collaborating, working together to make a difference in this world or the universe, as you will. I appreciate any thoughts you have along this line.
Yeah, thanks so much. On the one hand, this fundamental mechanism, natural selection that Darwin and Wallace kind of came up with, seems extremely kind of individualistic, right? And Darwin was even criticized in his day for this idea of cooperative interaction was not didn't seem to be a big part of his theory. Just for a moment, just thinking about the science, and I don't know if that's altogether accurate in that for Darwin, sort of thinking about. I think about his Descent of Man, his the book on human biology, human evolution, where I think he becomes keenly sort of appreciative of, humans. We are inherently, right. We are cooperative, right. And what sets us apart from other animals is, I mean, there may be a number of things, but Darwin sort of stresses this sense of sympathy, right, empathy. And I think his conception, and it may be simplistic coming as it does, long time ago, 19th century, this idea of origins of society, origins of institutions that are made possible by interconnectedness. So sociality is very much a part of us and our success, I think, as a species in general, but individual, culturally. And so there's that. But then the interesting thing, Bob, is that Darwin was also, in a very practical kind of way, he sort of reflects a kind of view of the world that is kind of very competition oriented. He's comes from a very, very well-to-do, very successful families in the wake of or in part of the Industrial Revolution, benefiting from that revolution. Very savvy investors, in the railways and canals, and very much kind of, that aspect of capitalism and such is kind of part of who he is. And it's in that respect that we see such an interesting contrast with Wallace, who I think he got and understood the individualistic selection idea, and he understood and accepted the idea of people working cooperatively. But he because of his personal convictions, he internalized that, and he himself was very much egalitarian. A self-declared socialist, really interested in cooperative living, very much an Owenite socialist, in the idea of, let's work together, everybody. Something that Darwin didn't have time of day for that kind of stuff. So that's such an interesting contrast, between the two of them. Is that why Wallace was, sort of famously, such a poor investor, and why he was hemorrhaging money left and right, and Darwin counted his ability to sort of invest and parlay his already substantial fortune into even bigger fortunes as one of his great skills that he inherited from his father. It's very curious.
Just to conclude, I noticed that that's what Isaac Newton spent the last years of his life looking at civilization. And his last book, the last chapter, concludes that we have to look towards the more cooperative
to survive. That's interesting. Yeah. I need
thank you.
To look that up. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
One little PS to the conversation, because it is relevant, that you may know of this, but there were reactions against the sort of what many saw as an overemphasis on competition in struggle for existence in Darwinian thinking. By the end of the century, there were thinkers that were promoting a more cooperative view of things, and I'm thinking about Peter Kropotkin and his book. I want to say maybe it came out in 1902, Mutual Aid, for example, and he called that an overlooked factor in evolution. Helping each other.
Right. Yeah, that takes us right to symbiosis too, and I think we didn't have time today to talk about geography and just the way ideas move and are shaped. And you've just mentioned, I mean, the flow of ideas from Russia, for instance, into Europe, from Europe. This is a whole nother conversation, Jim, and it's right there in your book. It's a great platform for doing that. Nor did we have time to talk about borderlands and border crossings, which I got up to 17, I think maybe 20 different places that I saw. I was making notes as I went along.
Did you think it worked?
Yeah.
I think that worked well, exploring Wallace's life as a whole series of interesting boundaries and borders.
He's crossing boundaries, boundary after boundary. And then when you flesh that out, especially the geologic information that comes later, but it goes at this sense of, without knowing, you're trying to reach out to what we don't know. You don't have what the information we have today, but yet coming to some very interesting conclusions, and crossing those borders seems to be an important factor in discovery, in facilitating his capacity to think new ideas.
Yeah.
It's harder to do that when you're sitting in an office.
Yes.
And closed in on, but at any rate, Steve, I think we'll take this as the last question.
Thanks, Jim, for mentioning Asa Gray, who is the American, who's still famous. He wrote Gray's Manual, which is still used as the North American botany. So he's the most famous botanist probably of the 1800s. But he defended Darwin, and I think in the century later, in 1950s, in the God is Dead movement, if you will, something happened that Asa Gray really didn't want to happen. Neither did Darwin. Asa Gray was critical of and rightfully so, in a nice way, about Darwin and wrote so. But one thing he said was very interesting. He said this theory can be used uh, in a way to become an atheist. But he said, indeed, any scientific theory can be used to become an atheist if so desired. And that happened in the 50s with this movement. And I think journalistically and sociologically, we've been on a rabbit trail that needs to be addressed. So I wrote an article about it and about and named it Did Charles Darwin Believe in Design? The answer may surprise you. And the surprising was, in his famous last sentence, he used breathed into one form or many's. And many people asked, why breathed? Well, Genesis 2:11 was the answer. And they said, well, why don't you put in by the Creator? And he did. There are 6 editions. His last 5 editions, when he put that in, he never took it out. He referenced the Creator with a capital C in Origins 19 times and God once, and a quote from someone else about God. They never came out, even though there was an extra chapter eventually added onto Origins. So I thought we have a sociological, journalistic revisionism that we need to address, that has addressed the church, and we haven't addressed it well. So Perry Marshall picked up on the article and put it on his Evolution 2.0 website, his ASA contributor. And so on chat, I put the HTTP to that. And if anybody has comments on it, it talks about teleology and theology. I mean, and theodicy, because it's something that's really we need, I think, a better answer on those. And so any comments on that article would be appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fair to say that Darwin really I think it reflects his personal struggle with these ideas that he wrote to Asa Gray in one letter soon after the Origin, came out, that he didn't intend to write. This is sort of almost a direct quote. I didn't intend to write atheistically, right? And he sort of it pained him that he was painting his friends and his family. But it all turned on this question of design, especially with Gray, and this question of how personal a creator is there. But I do sort of emphasize that in my commentary on the Origin and in my classes. It's quite interesting to look at cases where Darwin's language seems to be infused with a kind of a religious sensibility or maybe a theological kind of overtone. As you mentioned, Steve, about creator being mentioned, life being breathed into, maybe one form, maybe many. And you're right, all through the multiple, the 6 editions of the Origin, never took it out, never changed that. And so, some might suggest that taking cases like those, but also the epigraphs that I mentioned earlier, that Darwin was speaking directly to his more theologically minded friends and looking to win them over and see that these ideas need not be seen as contrary to their religious beliefs. And it may be one reason why he greatly appreciated Gray's defenses and even financed the republication of Gray's papers and speeches on the subject, had them reprinted in pamphlet form, eventually kind of collected into a book because he thought that was such an eloquent, and to come from a committed, deeply religious individual, his friend, who, he really had great esteem for, he thought that would go much further towards helping those that saw his ideas at odds with theology, would help them see that need not be the case.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I have a deep feeling for Darwin in a way as I get to know him better through reading, and that he, for me, has become a real example of trying to go for factual basis about theodicy. When his daughter died, Annie, it affected him greatly.
Mm.
And toward his later life, he was, in many ways, wishing he hadn't written so favorably toward God.
Mm.
And so he's a really good example of we need to handle this idea of theodicy
Yeah.
in a more factual way, and we're torn by it. So I appreciate him a lot for that. He didn't go one way or all the other. But he was very affected in life by his daughter's death.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very, very difficult time. And it's fair to say that Darwin was never very doctrinaire in his religious, even when he was studying ostensibly to become a clergyman. I think somewhat cynically, his dad probably had him baptized in the Church of England, so just as an insurance policy, so that if he needed to go to Cambridge or Oxford, he could.
Religion was a good paying job. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I guess he ultimately really admired, well, he appreciated Huxley's term, agnostic. And he and Huxley too, they sort of argued that, well, Huxley maybe especially in an explicit way, that was a kind of intellectually honest position, that, acknowledging that you don't know, instead of just outright declaring, yay or nay, that you accept or you reject. And so he would never say he was an atheist, of course, Darwin. But it is interesting, especially after the death of his daughter, in 1851. That was a dark, dark kind of period. He referred to his insufferable grief, and had a very difficult time imagining what purpose, if in a universe of design and beneficence, what purpose, the death of a, beautiful, innocent child could possibly serve. And he wanted to believe that can't be designed. It's simply, this is an unfortunate consequence of just natural laws, that if there is a creator, the creator set up, that kind of thing. So I find it fascinating how Darwin did wrestle internally and with his colleagues like Lyell, who is also very devout, and Gray, and how they tried to square, these ideas.
Well, it's something in history to realize that Huxley's great-great-grandson Julian in the 50s was the center of marrying evolution with atheism. And I put that in my article, and quote a part of his speech that caused that turn. And I think it is what we've been struggling ever since the 50s to unmarry atheism from evolution. And so I hope that's a good source that I put in the article.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That is helpful, and maybe a way to draw this conversation to a close. Joseph, I'm aware of your the pictures you want to show, and I think Janelle has told me that Ted Davis's Biologos article is up in the chat, and that many of those pictures on the Scopes trial are there. So maybe we can direct people to that, and we'll let that go.
Yeah.
Jim, it has been so good to have you with us today. We're going to have a few announcements, and I'll tell you thank you at the very end. But Janelle,
just want to remind everybody of the annual meeting, and I will see many of you there. And then in the chat, I put the link to the page where you could get a virtual pass if you can't be there in person, to join us virtually. So it's there.
all right. Thank you, Janelle. And I'll remind you that over the next 2 months, in diving deeper in the August and September, we will have keynote speakers from the annual meeting, which starts next week. And those keynote speakers will be with us in August. Our guest will be Robert Damulera, who is with the Mott Foundation, their Clean Energy Access for Climate Change program. And he'll be speaking, of course, next week at our conference, and then he'll come back to do a reprise. So join us again in August and September for those conversations. And then I was one last thing, Jim, as we close. You had a reference to, I think it's Jonathan Topham's work on Bridgewater treatises and that.
Yeah, the Bridgewater
Tom?
treatises. Yeah.
Yeah. He was our guest on Diving Deeper
Oh,
this last year
yeah.
on his new
Great.
book.
Yeah.
On the Bridgewater treatises. Excellent. And a nice
Yeah.
connection with your work. And that period of time is a very fruitful time. So thanks for bringing this
It's
to us.
fascinating. It was Whewell's Bridgewater treatise that Darwin quoted in one of his epigraphs in The Origin, actually. I
Yeah.
believe Whewell's was the third of the Bridgewater treatises.
Okay. All right. It's a fascinating period of history, one that, as Steve points out, we have not really captured in the 20th and 21st century all that well, and there's much more work to be done. And Radical by Nature, Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace is going to help us do that. So thanks again, and enjoy the Galapagos.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited. Thanks so much. Really, really appreciate the opportunity and so appreciate all the great questions and the engagement. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. See some of you soon.
See you soon.